Thanks for listening to the GOSH podcast. GOSH stands for the Gynecologic Oncology Sharing Hub, an open space for real and evidence-based discussions on gynecologic cancers. We'll share the stories of gynae cancer patients and survivors and hear from researchers and clinicians who are working behind the scenes to improve the lives of people with gynecologic cancers. Our podcast is produced and recorded on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It is produced by the Gynecologic Cancer Initiative, a province-wide initiative in British Columbia with the mission to accelerate transformative research and translational practice on the prevention, detection, treatment, and survivorship of gynecologic cancers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sabine, and I will be the host of this episode of the GOSH podcast. Today, we have two incredible individuals joining us. We have Golda Arthur, who is an award-winning audio producer, showrunner, and journalist based in New York City, who creates innovative podcasts that deeply connects with listeners. Over the course of her 20-year journalism career, she has worked on breaking news, produced long-form documentaries, and led teams of creatives on deadline. She worked in radio at BBC and CBC, where she got her start in broadcast journalism in Halifax. She then went on to launch and run podcasts at Vox Media and MIT Technology Review, leading acclaimed shows like Land of the Giants and Today Explained. In 2023, she launched Overlooked, an award-winning podcast about women's health, which we will dive into on today's episode. She also teaches audio reporting at Columbia University. We are also joined by Golda's mom, Teresa Arthur, a retired chemistry teacher who was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer in 2018. She was treated with chemotherapy, underwent a hysterectomy, and went into remission later that year. But recurrence has been the nature of the beast, and she was in and out of treatment for the next 5 years. All along, Teresa has stayed pragmatic but also optimistic. She is a patient partner and has participated in cancer-focused seminars and conferences, gives feedback on research studies, and combines her knowledge, curiosity, and love for science with her experience as a patient and survivor. For those of you who know her, Teresa gives main character energy and was in fact the subject of the first season of the award-winning podcast about ovarian cancer called Overlooked, which was created and produced by Golda. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Welcome, Golda and Teresa, and thank you for joining me today on the GOSH podcast. I'm really excited for myself and our listeners to hear and learn more about your stories. So I'm just going to dive in. I want to first discuss as kind of a question for both of you. I want to hear about kind of the journey of the Overlooked podcast, how it began. I know it began from a personal story, and I'd really like to know kind of what that moment looked like for you and the diagnosis and kind of how it sparked the idea.
I could start with, it says the question is for both of us, so I could give you a brief background of the diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Well, the diagnosis, capital, all big letters, right? July 7th, 2018. I remember the date. I mean, it's etched in everybody's minds. It's a shocker. It was devastating for all of us, for the family. I remember the scenario so well. I was in the hospital in the emergency, which I think we'll go into later. But this doctor just comes in and says, I have some bad news. You have cancer. So in anybody's wildest dreams, healthy person, just retired, looking forward to lots of stuff happening. It's not, you're not able, I think, I haven't ever been to a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I'm sure they would tell you this is something, these words would probably be on the top of the list of my mind's blown kind of, But in my head, I'm thinking, that's a terrible thing. That's really bad, I think. And then I could see my husband who was standing in front of me, and we had two or three more friends. This was before the pandemic in 2018. So there was, people were allowed to come in and out of an emergency room, unlike now. And we had a couple of friends standing there, and I could just see their faces, and whatever I was feeling was the opposite of what I know they're going through. So if they're shocked, I'm not. If they are devastated, I felt I wasn't. If they didn't know what to do, they were ready to collapse, I'm saying I have to get up and do something. So it was like something that woke up inside of me and said, we need to do something. So my next question to the doctor was, so what are we doing about it? So the next thing that came up was, it was just, you have cancer. What cancer? So the next step was, we have to do all these tests. You have two options. You can go back home and you can get all the tests done through your family doctor, or you stay in hospital for like whatever time, and we'll do a rapid series of tests morning, noon, and night, so that we can diagnose which cancer it is, like which one. Obviously, I opted for the second one, which was I'm going to stay in the hospital. And I think the last time I had been to the hospital prior to that must have been like 20 years ago, when I broke my arm and I had to get that fixed. So I wasn't a hospital goer as such. I mean, frequenting hospitals, I wasn't one of those. So this was like, I'm perfectly healthy. I'm not feeling anything big, major. But let's see what this is about. And those 4 days of testing was like a precursor to what was to come in the future. It was like, colonoscopies, sigmoidoscopies. It was lung testing, X-rays, CT scan, the works, till they finally got to one of the signs of ovarian cancer is that you get fluid in your peritoneal cavity. And so they withdrew that in the operating theater, and they analyzed it. And that's where they found CA125. So finally, after 4 days, there was a diagnosis. So it took that long to.
And I bet that 4 days felt like an eternity.
It felt like it was just actually, it was too rapid for my brain, like, because whenever being an inpatient, I think whenever there's an opening for any kind of diagnostic test, they just wheel in the inpatient, right? So so then you can't have breakfast today, don't have lunch today, don't have dinner, you need to be on an empty stomach. I lost about maybe 5 pounds in those 4 days. And well, at least we had a diagnosis after 4 days. So it was like, it looks like it's ovarian cancer, because somebody came, did a pap smear, did all the other tests that had to be done, and they took all the tissues for testing, and they said, yeah, conclusively it's ovarian cancer. So I left the hospital, and then they put me on to the cancer center, and I heard words like gynae op, CA125, stage 3, 4, for the first time in my life. So, that was the beginning that was the kindergarten of of the ovarian cancer learning process. So yeah, that was diagnosis, I think.
And it's very interesting to hear how you kind of, as your family and friends were you saw all the expressions and what they were going through, you kind of moved in a different direction where you're like, I need to get something done, which I guess might even surprise listeners, but I think a lot of patients feel that way. And I'm wondering, Golda, how that felt for you, and kind of how that journey moved on to the Overlooked podcast.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Mom tell it again, I'm remembering how traumatic it was. And I think it was the kind of trauma that you don't realize you're going through it while you're going through it. And then you look back and you're like, oh, that was traumatic. So at the time, of course, we weren't calling it Overlooked. And Mom was keeping diaries of her journey. And at some point, I would have suggested to her that she turn them into audio diaries, that wherever she's going, whatever she's doing, whether it's chemo or doctor's appointments, that she just record herself on her phone, on her voice memo app. And I said, I don't know, maybe one day we'll make a podcast about it. And it was really just sort of a throwaway comment at the time. And this was in 2018, right, Mom? 2018? Yeah. And I did try in 2018 and 2019. I interviewed Dr. James Bentley, who was Mom's oncologist at the time in Halifax. And I interviewed a lady who worked for Ovarian Cancer Canada. And then I just stopped because it was too much. It was like, I tried to do it as a journalist and tried to have kind of an outside perspective of it. And the bit of me that was a daughter took over, and I stopped because I just couldn't. And then I sort of tried again. I must have tried again at some point, and then the pandemic happened. And then in 2023, in January of 2023, Mom said to me, I have all these audio diaries. I have like 5 years worth of audio diaries. What do you want me to do with them? And I was like, oh my God, you're still collecting them. And 2023 was 5 years since Mom's initial diagnosis. So at that point, I thought, like, it's now or never. If I don't make this podcast this year, I'm probably never going to make it. So I started in January of 2023, and I released the first season, which was all focused on ovarian cancer, in September of that year. And I think the deadline really helped as well. I wanted to get it published during Ovarian Cancer Awareness Month. And so that's kind of how that came about, but it was not a straight line that here's Mom's diagnosis, let's make a podcast about ovarian cancer. It took 5 years, basically. It really evolved. There were lots of stops and starts. Yeah.
That's so smart that there was that you kept Teresa like audio diaries. I think that's not just helpful,
Yeah,
obviously, for the podcast, but for you.
that was a momentous moment for me when the first time she said we'll make a podcast. And I think my initial reaction was, if I'm not mistaken, Golda, like, oh, what, me? Okay, I'll give it a try, kind of, like this is totally new for me, but okay, I'll try, was my first reaction. The second one was more for myself, and which was a little sort of, mind searching kind of thing, and saying to myself, how will this help anybody? Like, who will it help, or how will it help? And the third one was sort of the third thought was answering my own question and saying, maybe this will give some meaning to what I'm going through, like there's something will come out of it, kind of. I mean, I always find use for things to recycle them, even around the house. So I thought, yeah, why not? Maybe we can recycle this whole episode of ovarian cancer. And the last but not the least was a sense of pride and confidence in Golda's ability as a podcaster to bring that meaning to my whole journey and diagnosis and the treatment. So I knew she would. It was like I had not an iota of doubt that she would handle this with like emotion, and sort of at the same time use it to spread a message. She has that activist thing in her, kind of. So, why not be an activist for ovarian cancer as well? So, and that got me on another, in another direction, with like joining Ovarian Cancer Canada's PPIR program, where, I felt I could really do something, and quite a bit of, like many things out here in Nova Scotia where I'm now part of. So that sparked it for me as well. But these were the thoughts going on in my head when she said, let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, the project is so special. And obviously, as you said, Golda is a very impressive person. And I feel like this kind of segues into my next question, which is about kind of your career. You have had such a remarkable career in journalism before even you started the Overlooked podcast. How do you feel like your background in news and storytelling influenced your shift to podcasting? It's a really interesting shift, and you kind of explore a lot of personal stories and sensitive topics. So, how do you feel like your journalism career helped you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very challenging question to answer, Sabine, but I'll give it a shot. And the reason it's challenging is because I think the truth of it is that in making Overlooked, I'm doing the opposite of what my training has had me do all of these years. Um, I so on the first part of it, I moved from radio to podcasting back in 2016, and I have been in podcasting, ever since. So I've been, as an executive producer, I've been making podcasts for other people and organizations and clients. And so that shift was not too wild, but making a podcast that was so personal, that was really different. My training is in news, and I came up in a generation of journalists that believed in objectivity, which preceded the kind of the larger conversation we're having in the media today about, what objectivity means and the view from nowhere and that kind of stuff. So my training has always had me stay at a distance from the story. And this was the opposite. I couldn't get closer to this story, because at some point the podcast also involved me talking about myself, because I have the RAD51 gene, I have the RAD51C gene mutation, just like mom does. And so then I was like, wait, am I going to have to talk about myself? And that made me really uncomfortable. But I leaned into it because it's what the story demanded, I guess, right? And the genetics part of ovarian cancer is a very big part of the story. I don't think you can tell a story about ovarian cancer without talking about genetics. So then I was like, okay, well, the story that I'm reporting on as a journalist needs me to talk about myself here. And so I think that was kind of the shift, that I had this whole career that suddenly I had to go and do the opposite of what I just was trained to do. Suddenly I had to ask myself, does that training even matter anymore? And I'm certainly asking myself that now in media and in podcasting. We are having really big conversations about the future. And so I had to figure out, well, how can I make this in a way that keeps mom safe, keeps me safe? And I think by the word safe, I was trying to say, like, we have to tell the truth about things, but we also have to make this mean something to other people. And I think that was the way out for me. What does this story mean to other people? Other people like mom, or other people like me. And since Overlooked's first season, and now this season 2 and season 3 have come out as well, I've really been amazed at how many people have been motivated to write to me after they've heard it and just say to me, oh my God, I'm right there with you. My mom has ovarian cancer, or I have ovarian cancer. And they wrote to me, and they still continue to write to me. And I'm just blown away by the stories. I'm blown away by the fact that they thought it was useful and helpful. And so I do feel like, oh, okay, that's it. I can check that box. This podcast did what I set out to have it do, which is help other people. And I know that that was really important to mom as well, that we didn't just make this about her and her story, that there was meaning in it for others. I think what became really clear at the end of it was that there's this whole story around ovarian cancer. There's this whole cancer that was not being seen at all. And women who had ovarian cancer were not being seen either. There were problems with diagnosing it. There are problems with treating it. We haven't had innovation in ovarian cancer in decades. And then you guys come along and you do such great work, that I was like, okay, this is the moment to tell this story as well. And I think that that helped me to feel like I was standing on solid ground with it, because at some point I was just drowning in tape and I was drowning in the story, and I was like, you know, having to shift perspective from daughter to sort of storyteller or narrator, I was lost. So I had a couple of things in place that kept me moving forward and in a straight line. And certainly thinking about how it would land with listeners was one way to do it.
Yeah, and I think the shift to podcasting is kind of important, and I do see why so many people are contacting you about it. I think even as for me as a podcast listener, I think it is something that it's starting to give people the news through podcast form, and I think people like to listen to it, people relate to it, people like to hear conversation rather than just reading a story, right? And I think that's really important, especially when it's this personal.
Mm-hmm.
But with with talking about kind of the personal story, I'd like to shift to Teresa a little bit. I just want to hear about kind of what the first sign was. That we heard a little bit about your journey at the first day in that hospital, but what was the first sign that led you to actually seek medical help? And how was it to navigate the healthcare system? Because everyone has kind of a different journey with that.
It had nothing to do with ovarian cancer. My first
Hmm.
encounter with getting to the hospital had nothing to do with ovarian cancer. My family doctor, prior to getting to that ovarian cancer diagnosis stage, sent me in for ultrasound, infrasound, because I was getting some abdominal pain when I early, March, April of 2018. So he sent me for these two tests, some blood tests to check the liver output. There was like bloating, there was pain. And they came back with a diagnosis which said, I have lots of gallbladder stones in the gallbladder. They did mention one thing, that they were finding it difficult to kind of locate stuff inside, because there was this murky fluid all over. So now that is like such a obvious sign, but at that time he missed it as well, sort of, in a way. So I was scheduled for gallbladder surgery, which was put back to September of 2018, because it took that much time to be on the list. The doctor was going on summer vacation, and it was there waiting for my name would come up sometime in September. But by July, I was getting more regular pain, and I thought gallbladder's playing up again. So after 2 consecutive nights of pain, my husband insisted that we go to emergency. And I thought, okay, I'm going to emergency. They'll take me and they'll do an emergency gallbladder surgery. So that's how I landed up in the emergency room. And they said, what they basically said is, I don't think it's anything to do with your gallbladder. Yes, you do have stones, but you have cancer. That was how that came out. So that was my first brush with the word cancer.
Hmm.
It came through a gallbladder issue. So one organ led to another, kind of,
Yeah.
being looked
And
at.
it's interesting to hear that, because I feel like everyone's story who I speak to about cancer, it's never what you expect that led them to getting things checked, right?
Mm.
And kind of looking back on that time, what was the hardest part about sharing your diagnosis, as you said, with your friends who are at the hospital, but especially with your children?
My Golda and my daughter, youngest daughter, Esther, were in London. Golda was on holiday and she lives there. Esther lives there. My son was coming here anyway, like a couple of days after my diagnosis, when I got back home. So he was the first one we told, but I was very, very, very nervous about when it came to telling the children. It was, I don't want to do this. I was very hesitant. Firstly, as to how they would react. And I'm like not there they're not with me to, for me to hold them up kind of in this moment. There was even a sense of guilt that I shouldn't tell them and rock their own world and their lives, because at that time, that many years ago, I have 7 grandkids, and some of them were just 1 year old. 2 of them were just 1 year old babies. And so everybody's like, doing their own thing. They have their own lives. And to throw this thing at them, I was very hesitant to tell them about it. It was like, I don't want to do this. It's like, it was difficult. That was the most difficult part.
I bet. And how has sharing this story kind of changed your relationship with each other?
It was two-pronged kind of. Firstly, sharing the story, like for me, it was like Golda, the producer of this podcast. So, okay, she knows better what to do. She's, like tells me how to do it. This is what you should do. It's like directing the podcast, right? So I had to cut myself off from the role of mother-daughter kind of there at those days or that time. Also, I think there was a bit of a role reversal, like through the journey of cancer more than the podcast thing as well. It was like a role reversal from parent to child. So like, she being the matriarch, she's the oldest of my 3 children. So being the oldest, she just took over the reins, even though I remember when we broke the news to her, she was the one who broke down first. And my younger daughter was like, kind of supporting her. But I think she stepped up to the plate as the eldest child in the family and like just took over being the strong one, organizing everyone, who visited when, who came for what, and, how do we do this? Like everything was like looked after, sort of like when she was here, even when she wasn't, tickets were booked in advance for all the whole family kind of thing. And so, Aaron's coming, and that's my son. He's coming on this day. He'll be here for this long. And it, even through the pandemic, it was like, everything was like all organized. Golda's a great organizer, as you can see from her. You haven't seen the sticky notes that usually go up on her wall.
Okay.
Color coordinated and all that. She just took over. But she was like on a different, it was a different role that I saw Golda play. And sort of, it was nice to have her take on that role, like that strong person. And I think doing the podcast with her reinforced that kind of, I could see the strength coming out of her that I'd never seen before. So that I think was the two things that really came through, and that was how it was for me.
Oh, thanks, Mom. So it turns out that both as a daughter and as a producer, being bossy comes very easy to me.
I think that's the eldest child syndrome. I have that too.
Yeah, it's totally eldest daughter meme. Yeah. So I think, obviously it's brought me and Mom much closer. So in a physical sense, for example, I live in New York, and I would travel back to Halifax, Nova Scotia, quite a lot to do recording, to build up this podcast, basically. So I saw much more of them, of Mom and Dad, which is great. I had a chance to be there for chemo, for example, for the episode on treatment. I recorded that little beepy machine. I could like hear that in my dreams, the machine, the chemo machine. And I was there in the room. And my brother and sister have also had a chance to be in the room with the chemo, but I think that I got to do it a little bit differently because I interviewed the chemo nurse, and I interviewed Mom's oncologist, Dr. Lana Shatirjit. And I interviewed mom's oncology nurse. And so I got to know the people involved in this cancer differently, in addition to being there with mom. I got to understand the science in a really in-depth way. Mom and I have this inside joke that she's a science teacher and I'm a liberal arts major. And whenever something happened, so many parts of this cancer, I did not understand. I did not
Yeah.
understand it for 5 years. And I look back on it now and I think, how did I just not understand this stuff? And I discovered is that most people are like that this stuff is really complicated. And for whatever reason, doctors don't always have the time to really explain it to you. So there were many times when I would say to mom, what does this mean? And she would talk like a scientist. She would talk like a scientist is talking to another scientist. And I would say, yeah, but I'm a liberal arts major, mom, and I don't understand what you just said. So she would be like, okay, let me talk to you like you are a liberal arts major. So I think that, I saw a different side of mom as well, where she had such a firm grasp of the science and of what was going on in her body. And I certainly understood things much more after that, after talking to her. I do feel quite protective of her in a way that I don't necessarily with other, in my journalism career, it's not always my job to protect a source. Like if I'm talking to someone who's, for example, a politician or somebody involved in policy, I will just ask them a question and have them say out loud what the answer is. I do feel differently about things, about someone at the heart of the story when I'm talking to them. And my mom was that person at the heart of the story. So that's where I think she would say things, or there were a couple of diaries where I thought were too intimate to put in the podcast. So I didn't, I just made that editorial and executive decision that this diary is too personal, mom, and I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use something else. So kind of to see my mom as a story was a new thing for me. So yeah, so I think becoming closer to her was just one aspect of it. But yeah, I think it really deepened our relationships, and we probably saw different sides of each other through making this podcast.
Yeah. And with that experience, how do you feel like what was the most kind of surprising challenge in talking about health and cancer in a podcast and creating a podcast around it?
I found the science hard to understand, and that was a challenge. Maybe it wasn't as surprising because I'm like, yes, of course it's hard to understand. And also I'm a liberal arts major. But so that was one thing. And then I talked about sort of how I dealt with mom as a source, in a way. I think the thing that I found I was really blown away by is coming back to this idea of the people who wrote in after they heard the show. And I didn't realize how overlooked women felt. I didn't realize how overlooked women felt. And my challenge then was, well, what will I do with this? People were writing to me to say, not only do I understand this cancer better, but I feel seen. And it's the I feel seen bit that really took me aback. But maybe I knew it theoretically, but to see it in black and white in an email from somebody living in Australia who I don't know, who doesn't know me, just telling me, you made me feel seen. Your mom made me feel seen.
You
I
feel
was
like you've
like,
done it, like this is what you wanted
yeah,
to do. Yeah.
yeah. And in a way, I feel like that puts a little bit of responsibility on me as the maker of the podcast, right? How can I hold that person's story as tenderly as I held mom's?
Yeah.
So I would write back to everybody who wrote to me. And I think the idea for keeping Overlooked going beyond the story of ovarian cancer and mom's story came from that. And so that was my response to that challenge of like, well, what do I do with this whole new level that has kind of come up? And so I moved Overlooked beyond the story of ovarian cancer. And now I've put out 2 seasons this year, and I've covered everything from IUD insertion to like a remapping of the ovaries themselves to ADHD in perimenopausal women. And still, women are writing to me to say, wow, I feel seen. And so for as long as they're doing that, I'm going to keep Overlooked going, because
Yeah.
it still doesn't cease to surprise me how much work there is to be done in women's health in this respect.
Absolutely. And your work in Overlooked has been recognized with prestigious awards. And so, why do you feel that the health focused podcasts resonate so strongly with our audiences today? I feel like you've already kind of discussed that a bit, but what do you think?
Yeah, it's goes back to that,
Hmm.
to that idea that we have a lot of work to do in women's health.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of research work to do. We have a lot of questions that are unanswered that we need to start to even ask out loud, which we haven't been doing before. There's so much work to be done in women's health funding, whether that is on the sort of the university and research side, helping folks like you guys, get your work done, or even there's like a bunch of startups. I talked to a bunch of startup founders this year who are trying to do work that hasn't been done before, and they're working with venture and private funding, not enough funding there. And then there's just like that much more attention that we need to give to women, in terms of how we dismiss them. And I say, I don't blame doctors, I don't blame the medical profession, I don't blame anyone. I think we all as a society are guilty of dismissing ourselves as women, dismissing other women, not believing women.
Yeah.
When we say, and when we are not believed as women, we tend to doubt ourselves. And that's one thing that mom has always actually said to me, of like, um, don't shrink yourself so somebody can deal with you better. If you've got a big issue, or if you have something big to say, just say it. Let the world
Absolutely.
deal with it. And I found that incredibly helpful, because I've spent most of my life making myself palatable for other people, and I think done. I'm done in
That's
that
very
respect.
important advice.
Yeah,
I think everyone needs to hear that. And I just have two more questions to close off, and then we're done. This is kind of to both of you. What do you hope listeners, especially women, take away from Overlooked?
mom.
Um, Women's health, especially, like, being aware of that, uh, just raising uh, awareness in yourself, but not only as a woman. Like, you may be at the stage where you are about to go perimenopause, premenopause, or any of, like, maybe ovarian cancer, uterine cancer. Not just that. I think we should look a little before that, and I'm talking of young people, young girls, basically, like having, I've taught, high school uh, chemistry, and it's in a girls' school. And there's a whole subject matter out there with young girls that needs to be also dealt with. I don't know I've not looked into what the research is into that area of of a woman's life before you become like a woman as such. But many of the issues, I think, start there. So I don't know, maybe this is the next idea for a podcast for Golda, like looking at young people, young girls, young women, because even as if you look at yourself, much of the stuff that you go through in the later years of your life somehow have a basis, whether it comes to mental health, physical health, habits, just character building, or whatever it is, really starts over there. I mean, it may be the same for men, but the men are well looked after a while. There's lots of money for medical things and research and things like that. But that would be nice if somebody went a little, not take it from that part where you are 40 in your 40s, but maybe go a little bit where they're younger and look at women's issues there. That's what I would like people to look at as well, to take away, to talk about, like look at their young girls and see, because so many things get at that age get passed off as, oh, this is that time of life, like, right, you're about to go through your periods. So that's much earlier than actually like dealing with that, to train, to kind of equip you to deal with something that comes later.
Absolutely.
So that's my hope. So next podcast, Golda. Next theme.
What do I hope listeners will take away from Overlooked? That they're not overlooked. That they're seen.
Perfect. That's a perfect answer.
Yeah.
And I guess this kind of leads into the last question, but where do you see your advocacy work going in the future, both for Overlooked and beyond?
So, it's funny. I don't, as a journalist born and raised, I'm always sniffy about advocates, because advocates come to any given issue with an agenda. And so that's an interesting thing to see myself. Like, I ask myself, am I an advocate? And what is my agenda? And that's new for me. And I don't know, other people may look at me and say, oh, hell yeah, you're an advocate. But I still don't identify myself as an advocate, because I like to ask questions from all sides. And I don't, my only agenda is that women's health is seen. If that makes me an advocate, I guess I am. But I still want to get a lot of different people in the conversation. I want to know, like, where is private venture money in women's health, right? And where are men? Where are men in women's health? I don't think we're going to move this needle unless everybody is in the room. And so I think what's next is, in 2025, I hope to release 2 new seasons of Overlooked in the spring and the fall. The spring season will have episodes about clinical trials for women's cancers. It'll have episodes about, I'm going to do a big series. You heard it here first. I'm going to do a big series on the history of women's health research. It doesn't go back that far. And it's going to be sort of a storytelling series. I would love to have live events where we pull people together and we have a visible and audible community that's advocating, I guess, like me, activating people to just like fly that flag for women's health. I'm saying all these things and I'm thinking to myself, this is how advocates talk, Golda. So I'm sort of new to this outfit. So pulling together community, women seeing other women in real time, doing a bunch of live podcast tapings, keeping the conversation going, finding a way to fund it all, and just like bringing it to the front of the stage so that it just hogs all the limelight. Because whatever the conversation is, I'm not really trying to manage the conversation. I'm just trying to make sure that conversation is out there, and that nobody feels like they're being left behind or invisible.
That's amazing. I can't wait for those new seasons and for that new podcast. That sounds very interesting. But thank you both for, taking the time to talk with me today. This was amazing. Is there anything else you guys want to share?
I do want to say something, actually. There are, just in case people who are new to podcasting or looking at this from the outside in, I did not do this on my own, nor was it just me and mom doing our thing. And so there's a couple of people that I want to say thank you to. Firstly, I had a little podcast team for that first season. Lissa Soep was my editor and always pulled me out of whatever long grasses I got lost in. Eric Gomez was my sound designer, and he's one of the most talented engineers I've ever met. He made me sound great. And Jessica Martinez Dios was my associate producer. And I'm also related to her, and she's like a brilliant producer as well. So these three people really helped that podcast come to life. But there are two editors that I want to say thank you to as well, because I think people underestimate how important it is to have an editor. The first is my father, Robin Arthur. I should also thank him for being my dad. And the second is my husband, Stephen Cunningham. And both of them have just held me and mom, very firmly and tenderly throughout as this podcast was made, because there were many times that I was completely difficult to deal with. Because when it takes hold of me, I'm like, I'm not cooking dinner today. I'm making a podcast. So my husband stepped in there in so many ways as an editor and as a partner, and my dad as well. So I want to say thanks to both of them.
I'd like to add a little bit there and say Golda's two siblings were great sounding boards. And I think it was one of those round the dinner table discussions, which are really noisy and hectic and usually table banging and stuff, that the title Overlooked came up, right, Golda?
My brother Aaron came up with that title, actually. Yeah.
There were also and he was the one who. So there have been many of those, like meetings with the family as well, where the two kids and their spouses have been, and even the grandchildren actually have been very, very supportive, very aware of what was going on, which is a big thing in a family. There's something happening, something like this, where your family is being like in the public eye, kind of, not in a big way, but out there kind of. And I think for that, you need your whole family's support.
It's so great that you guys both had all that support.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is so great.
Thank you, Sabine.
Thanks for joining us on the Gosh podcast. To learn more about the Gynecologic Cancer Initiative and our podcast, make sure to check out our website at gynecancerinitiative.ca.